Hello, everyone. I can see people joining us slowly but surely. Welcome to this Russell-Cooke webinar on cyber security and being cyber savvy in your charity. Thank you for coming along today. We are recording this webinar and in the next couple of days, you'll get an email with some links to the recording of this and also the slides that we'll be referring to shortly. So if you do want to share it with anybody else who you work with or who you think it might be useful for, you can do that. If you want to watch again, you can do that. So we plan to speak for about half an hour today, and then there'll be some time for questions. You can type questions into the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll wait till the end to look at the questions and take a few of those. We won't read out your name or your organisation's name when we read out the questions, so don't be concerned that anything is going to be identifiable on the recording. So we still have people joining, but we'll go ahead with some introductions before we get into the meat of it. So for those who don't know me, I'm a solicitor in the charity team. My name's Carla Whalen. I specialise, amongst other things, in data protection for charities. And I'm joined today by Tom Pritchard. Tom is a solicitor in our litigation and public regulation team. Among his many talents, Tom specialises in intellectual property cases involving trademark infringement and also cyber security response strategies. So you'll have the two of us with you for the next half an hour or so. So why are we talking about cyber security today? Well, the main reason we thought it would be a good time to visit this topic is that there's been an increase in cyber attacks since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, or at least there's been a rise in the number of those attacks being made public. Last year, the Charity Commission revealed that fraudsters had stolen over £3.5 million, not quite 35, £3.5 million from charities during the pandemic. And it had received 645 reports of fraud and cybercrime from charities between March and September last year. There's various theories as to why there's been this increase, from increased geopolitical tensions, so literally talking about espionage actors working at government level, right through to the more straightforward or perhaps banal fact that criminal groups who would normally go after people's credit card details needed to find new income sources when public spending reduced as a result of the pandemic. They realised that they could exploit vulnerabilities in organisation systems, often those vulnerabilities caused by a rapid rollout of remote working practices. So in the next half an hour, our plan is to look further at some of the most common cyber risks. We appreciate that some terminology can be a little bit baffling, talking about, phishing and vishing and spear phishing, and the list goes on. And often these terms actually, there are several terms that actually mean the same thing. So Tom's going to give a quick rundown of some of the key risks and what they mean in a moment. We'll also reflect on a couple of issues that have affected the charity sector in the last few years. We'll then look at the steps you could take to reduce these risks and what you can do to manage incidents when they happen. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Tom, and I will just open our slides. And leave Tom to talk about some of these common cyber risks.
Thank you, Carla, and good morning, everyone. So as Carla alluded, I'll be discussing the National Cybersecurity Centre's most recent risk reports. If you're not familiar, the National Cybersecurity Centre is a UK government organisation. It's an offshoot of GCHQ that was formed in 2016. And it provides advice and support to the public and the private sector regarding how to avoid cybersecurity threats. This most recent report that they've published highlights the following trends in cybersecurity attacks. the increased prevalence of business email compromise, BEC. BEC is reportedly the biggest cyber threat facing digital organizations. In such a case, a perpetrator gains access to business email accounts, which they then use to carry out fraudulent activities, such as fraudulent payments or data theft. Such attacks, as you might understand, often target the most senior individuals in the organization or those with the authority to pay payments. There's also cyber-enabled fraud, by which I'm referring, as you can see on the slide, to email spoofing and typo squatting. Email spoofing is where the perpetrator forges the sender email address in the header of the message to make the email appear genuine. And typo squatting is where the perpetrator creates a fake website that appears to be that of a real brand, but has a quite subtle typo in, and I'll go on to look at some examples of those later. There's also ransomware attacks. That's where attackers use malware to stop organizations accessing their own systems. Such attacks often have really significant impacts because you won't be able to access your own files and systems that are crucial to your day-to-day business operations. The report also noted that nearly all attacks involve tools and techniques that are quite easily accessible. The attacks tend to exploit security controls that have not been properly implemented, and they play on predictable kind of human behavior. So these attacks that utilize understanding human behavior include the bottom three that I've listed: phishing, credential stuffing, and password spraying. So phishing is just a form of social engineering that's used to where you deceive users so they'll disclose information or click on a bad link. I think that's something that we're all very familiar with. It's one that's been around for a long time. Credential stuffing is where you gain a valid username and password from one site, and then you use it on many other sites. I think it's something that we're all guilty of, is having, well, at least in the past, I should say, one username and password that you use across many different sites because there are just so many to remember. But that is a way that attackers utilize our own behavior. Then there's also password spraying, which is quite simply where you might take a very common password 123, and try it in a brute force attack on as many websites as possible. So those are the most common forms of attack that the National Cybersecurity Centre have seen in their last report. So one of the main reasons we wanted to talk to you today was about rogues and the threat that they pose to charities. So I suppose I'll start by answering who or what are rogues? Well, rogues are individuals or organizations who impersonate, imitate, or otherwise infringe on an existing trademark or brand. Rogues are distinguished from your run-of-the-mill intellectual property infringers because they generally seek to usurp your identity by creating a fake social media account or a confusingly similar website. The rogue could be one person imitating an individual or an organization for the purposes of creating a parody. We've seen lots of spoof kind of comedic accounts that don't do too much damage. But then it could go all the way up to an account run by sophisticated organized crime as a vehicle to defraud the public. So why should charities be concerned? Well, I think I've answered the question already there, but for charities, social media can be a great tool and can inform the public about their purposes, campaigns, and success stories. However, both social media and websites are really quite easy venues for rogues to operate in. A convincing rogue could defraud the public of money they thought was going to a legitimate charity and create reputational nightmares. Loss of revenue and external scrutiny are perhaps likely to follow. In addition to adverse publicity, this type of scenario could require the filing of a serious incident report with the Charity Commission. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that rogues won't always be malign. As I said, it could just be for the purposes of comedy or kind of impishness, to put it at its nicest. But it's important that you treat each case on its merits because, as I've outlined, it can be very serious. Moving on to the next slide to look at some examples. Here we can see a well-known example of a fake Apple website that was set up in China to capture personal data. Malicious spoof domains offer hackers endless possibilities, including phishing, vishing, ad fraud, or malware. In every case, one thing remains constant. The actor is using your legitimate name to drive traffic to a malicious activity. On the next slide, we'll see, thank you, we can see a real-life list of examples of spoof domain names that have sought to drive traffic to imitation websites. As you can see from the list, you don't have to be particularly imaginative or sophisticated to be successful. This is another example, a well-known example, in which someone imitated the entrepreneur Elon Musk, causing significant damage to the share price of his companies SpaceX, Tesla, and SolarCity. A fake social media profile is probably the most common form of impersonation attack. While charities may not traditionally think of social media accounts as assets, they provide real value in engaging with your users, your supporters, your volunteers, your funders, etc. And therefore they require real protection, just like all other digital assets. So on the next slide, I'm talking about what can be done to manage and combat rogues. Well, most social media platforms have internal reporting procedures that allow fraudulent or imitation accounts to be removed. The most well-known is probably Twitter's Blue Badge. If you're familiar with that, that establishes authentic accounts and allows the removal of imitations. I think to receive a Blue Badge, you need to be authentic, notable, and active. And you need to provide some supporting material. The program was suspended in December 2020. I'm not particularly sure why, but I know that it's going to be reintroduced in the next month. And if you don't yourself have that badge, I'm aware that charities are likely to have sufficient notability to acquire the mark. So all that would be left is that your account's going to be notable and active. So I'd encourage all charities to try and get that authentication if they can. Most major platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, they all have their own internal verification procedures that allow you to report rogues. And they give users more confidence that they're dealing with an authentic account. If you would like to have a rogue taken down, the most simple thing to do is to contact the platform and to provide some screenshots of activity. That should be sufficient. However, legal action can be elevated if the response from the platform is unsatisfactory. For example, I've done plenty of work in more formal takedown requests, which set out the relevant legislation, the requirements to act in good faith, the requirements that the platform comply with their own policies. And importantly, you provide notice that failure to act may cause the platform to be liable for your losses. So that may be the loss of profits that are caused by the confusion. Now, if someone is imitating you online or spoofing your website, the most pressing challenge can be finding out who is the owner. And you can usually find that out using the website that I've listed on the slide, whois.net. However, what you often find with these spoof domains is that they're registered using quite secretive domain hosting sites for obvious reasons. So where that information is unavailable, such impersonation online may justify what's called a Norwich Pharmacal application. It's an application that's just simply named after the case in which it was founded, but it's an application against the internet service provider, requiring them to disclose the identity of a website owner. So thereafter, depending on the confusion or the loss that's incurred, you may be able to pursue a claim for trademark infringement and or a passing off offence to compensate any damage to your reputation or income and to get a court order requiring that the domain cease operating. And lastly, as I've previously stated, this may require you to report to the Charity Commission.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to look at a particular example of a ransomware attack that some of you joining today might already be far too familiar with. So you remember Tom was talking briefly a moment ago about ransomware. So that's where a cyber attack effectively stops a charity or another organization from being able to access its own files, and then usually demands a ransom in order to return access to the files. So this example involves the software provider Blackboard. As many of you will know, Blackboard provide fundraising software that's used by lots of charities and other not-for-profits, including universities and colleges in the UK. They are based in the US, and last May, they found out that hackers had broken into their systems and had stolen a number of files, and including data relating to individual donors and others that their clients, Blackboard's clients, had stored on the software. Blackboard worked with US crime agencies to try to resolve the issue, and they ended up deciding to pay the hackers ransom. While all this was going on, Blackboard didn't actually tell their customers, i.e. the clients, being the charities, other not-for-profit organisations. And as far as I'm aware, they didn't report this breach at the time to any data protection supervisory bodies or regulators. They only went public in late June and July last year, depending on when you got your notification, and they sent out notifications to their customers, letting them know, and they also made a report at the same time to the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, and may well have made reports to other supervisory authorities in other jurisdictions. The notifications that many charities received effectively said, you know, don't worry about this, it's not particularly serious because the hackers didn't get hold of any financial data, they didn't get hold of any password data. Well, actually, that didn't turn out to be the case, and a few months later, some charities and other organisations received an update from Blackboard saying, sorry, we've now found out that some of those details were compromised. Now, today isn't a data protection seminar, so I'm not going to go into the details of dealing with a personal data breach, but some of you who are familiar with the requirements under the GDPR might have spotted some of the problems with that summary that I've just given, not least that Blackboard was a processor, so sort of service provider, processing their clients' personal data. So they should have told their charity clients and other clients without delay when they discovered the breach, so that those organisations, as the controllers of the data, could take a decision themselves about whether to make a report to the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, and under the GDPR that would need to be done within 72 hours, and or to warn individuals who'd been affected. As far as I'm aware, the ICO is still investigating Blackboard's role in all of this, so we may see further information coming out in due course on the data protection compliance side. What I wanted to focus on today is what we can learn from this from a cybersecurity perspective. So I've put a couple of things on the slide here. Firstly, obviously, using reputable suppliers. Now, particularly if those suppliers are going to be custodians of personal data, you're required under Article 28 of the GDPR to use reputable suppliers. That means doing some due diligence of a reasonable nature, and that's obviously going to depend on the size and reputation of the supplier that you're using, as well as the nature of the data that you're going to be supplying. So the more confidential, the more sensitive, the more large quantities of data, the more you'd be expected to do some due diligence to make sure this supplier can do the job. Make sure you've got a binding contract with those suppliers that compels them to comply, again, in the scenario where you're sharing data, personal data of people, that it obliges them to comply with Article 28 of the GDPR. Now, that includes provisions around data breach reporting. So what does it say about how they need to inform you if there's a personal data breach relating to your data? How quickly do they need to do that? What information do they need to give you? What assistance do they need to give you? You really want that to be in the contract, so that if something does go wrong, you can really challenge them. It may be that, for example, in that Blackboard scenario I just summarised, that there was actually a really quite serious breach of the contract for failing to tell their clients that there had been a breach until, in some cases, a couple of months later, by which time the hackers had had this data for a long time. If you can't sort of get out of the contract immediately, it doesn't mean you can't still ask the how, what, why questions of your supplier, so that you can be confident that this, mistakes do happen, issues do occur, security issues arise from time to time, but you want to be satisfied that this wasn't, a flaw that they really should have protected against. Equally, it might be that even if you don't think that there's been a sort of fundamental breach that could entitle you to terminate the contract early, you might then keep a note of these things and think about looking for alternative suppliers once the term ends. My real message in this particular slide is that your charity's cybersecurity provisions are only as good as your suppliers. So you can spend a lot of time looking at your internal systems, but if you don't also focus on third parties that you engage to help you, then you could find that you're in a situation where you're effectively in the spotlight for failing to safeguard data as a result of your supplier's failures. So turning to what you can do in your charity to reduce these cyber risks that we've been talking about. Firstly, keeping security up to date. So that means installing updates when you need to and not clicking that delay button. Things like firewalls and other security measures, making sure that if you are in charge of security within your charity, those things are in place, and that you pass those obligations down the line to staff to make sure that on their equipment that they're using, they are installing those security measures and keeping them up to date. Likewise, policies and procedures. Now, this is particularly important, I think, when we are working from home, when you have a more remote workforce. And I think a lot of people think that remote working or some sort of hybrid home and office working arrangements will become the norm for a lot of people. So having policies that recognise the specific risks that can arise with this kind of arrangement is really important. So policies that tell staff to avoid, as far as possible, mixing personal and work emails and personal and work devices where possible, because that's where a lot of the confusion can arise. A requirement to use a VPN, a virtual private network, or a cloud system to mean that you, as the organisation, retain control over the security of data and information that's being used in people's homes. Securing home networks as well, so making sure that people's home routers don't still have the default network passwords and default login credentials. These are relatively simple things that aren't going to cost anything in a lot of cases to the charity, but that could really make a difference. Training for staff, obviously we always say this, policies and procedures are only as good as the paper they're written on. You really need to tell staff that those policies are there, explain what they mean and tell them what they need to do. So I think, a bit like we're doing today, guidance for staff on what suspicious activity actually looks like and how they might be targeted so that they can be aware. And again, particularly while they're working from home. Home working also results in increased email traffic generally. So again, more scope for kind of human error. So we're talking about incorrect recipients in boxes or errors using the BCC field, those sorts of things. So encouraging staff to really slow down and check what they're doing. Particularly, if they're just clicking yes to a lot of things, that pop-up could be, or that link could be the malicious one. A requirement to obviously use strong passwords, prompts as well to staff to update passwords on a regular basis and to make them as strong as possible. You might include a requirement within your organisation for a password to have, a particular number of letters, combination of characters, symbols, etc. And encrypting sensitive information. I've also put here to stress test and audit your systems. Again, that sounds very grand, but it doesn't have to be, particularly if your organisation is relatively small and your resources are relatively limited. Some of these things can be about taking the time to go and see whether, if you were a user, you were Googling for your charity's name, looking on social media for your charity, are there any of those malicious sites out there impersonating you? Also looking and being really aware of old, out-of-date websites, web pages, etc., message boards, because those can cause some of the real difficulties for charities, those ones where people have forgotten all about them and no one's taking any notice. And the little quote that I put on the right-hand side of this slide, which is a quote from one of the ICO's monetary penalty notices that were given in a particular case involving the British and Foreign Bible Society. This is going back a couple of years now, but they were fined £100,000 by the ICO as a result of a cyber attack that exploited a weakness in an insufficiently secured internal network and enabled attackers to get to over 400,000 supporters' data. So, the ICO here is accepting that cyber attacks will happen and that they're not expecting you to be able to protect yourself against every, new and ingenious attack that might be out there. But in this case, the account was configured so that remote access rights were far too wide. And so, people well outside of the organization could get in. And they had a really easy to guess password, which again, is something Tom was talking about. You need to monitor and understand what's going on within your organization. And then, if something does go wrong, know what you need to do in an emergency. Who are your emergency contacts? If you use an external IT provider or support company, do you know who to call in an emergency? Are you confident that your charity has sufficient backups of information? So if there is an attack, you can shut down your systems without risking losing everything. Things like, do you understand reporting requirements and timescales for reporting? We talked about reporting personal data breaches to the ICO, and Tom's also mentioned potentially reporting serious incidents to the Charity Commission. It might be that your charity would have other reporting obligations as well in certain situations. So, for example, if you're providing services to a local authority or an NHS commissioning body or another department, public authority, there might be things in the contract that say that you have certain reporting obligations. It might be that you even need to make a report to the police via the Action Fraud website if there is a cyber criminal matter. So I note that there are a few questions have come in already. We did say we'd only talk for half an hour, so I'm going to hand over to Tom just for the last few minutes to talk about some new government funding available for cyber training. And as I say, I'd encourage you to put in the Q&A box any questions that you might have, because we'll have a look at those in a minute.
Yes, thanks, Carla. So a little bit of hopefully good news to finish on after some scary discussions preceding this. On the 10th of September 2020, as part of London's Tech Week, Digital Infrastructure Minister Matt Warman announced new funding for small and medium-sized businesses to improve cybersecurity. The funding comes in response to what is perceived, or the reality of heightened cyber threat, as many more of us work remotely during the pandemic. Now, the effort is largely focused on the healthcare sector, given its importance at this time. But small and medium-sized enterprises are being invited to apply for a slice of the £500,000 funding that's on offer. Participants in the programme will receive support and guidance to achieve the government's Cyber Essentials accreditation. The Cyber Essentials accreditation is a government-backed self-assessment scheme in which organisations assess themselves against 5 basic security controls, and then an assessor verifies the information that's provided. The current cost of obtaining that certification is £300 plus VAT, regardless of whether you pass. But the likely cost is, the cost is likely to be worth paying, because the Cyber Essentials accreditation is an essential prerequisite to bid on most government contracts now. So yes, hopefully that's a little bit of positive news at the end of our discussion of the many threats that exist in the digital sphere. So that's all we had to say for now. We will turn to the questions. So yes, Carla, I don't know, which one do we want to take first?
So we have a couple of questions in. So I will take the question about the requirement to change passwords often, and what's good practice. So the question is the requirement to change passwords often, e.g. every 3 months, still the safest approach? And would a single password with complexity requirements be a better approach? Well, I think I'm going to say the typical, can you do both? I think, ideally, and it's becoming more and more common, you would be asking people to change their passwords on a regular basis. And I do think quarterly is a sensible, kind of amount of time. And you would be saying to them, we want your passwords to be, for example, at least 10 characters, should involve a capital letter, should involve a number, should involve a symbol, so that it's not just password 123 and it's easy for, as Tom was talking about, malicious cyber criminals to get at your systems simply by guessing a very common password. Tom, I don't know if you have anything to add. I'm aware that there are more technical solutions for generating strong passwords, that if you were looking to protect very sensitive data, for instance, or using passwords for sharing, for instance, very sensitive data, it might be that you could look into one of those password generating tools, and because that makes them, they're just nonsense and complete gobbledygook. So, extremely hard to guess.
Yeah, I'd echo all those points, Carla. You obviously want to do both if you can. If you're going to pick just one of them, that's having a complex password or changing it often, I'd probably go for the complex password. Obviously, the more simple the password, the easier it's going to be to guess. And even as a cybersecurity expert, quote unquote, I get annoyed by the frequent requests to change my password, but it's for very good reason. Carla, do you want to pick the next question, or shall I?
Yeah, so there's a question about whether the Cyber Essentials certificate is the best way to self-assess a charity systems. Tom, I don't know whether you want to pick up on that one.
Yeah, happy to take that. Whether it's the best way, I don't think so. I think there are certainly private companies out there who will do a more thorough job of assessing the real life safety of your systems. But in terms of having something that's recognized, that's relatively cheap to obtain, and that allows you to bid for government contracts, there's no reason not to do it, really.
And then there is a slightly longer question, which has a sad background story to it. So this is an example of where a finance officer for a charity who was working from home during COVID was scammed, and it resulted in the charity losing almost all of its cash, bar a few £1,000s. The matter is currently being investigated, and the charity's liaising with its bank to try and retrieve the money. But the bank is saying that the employee, and presumably, therefore the charity vicariously, was responsible because the employee gave out all of the banking details to a scammer over the phone. Now here, apparently the employee was on the phone for 7 hours. And the question really is, the feeling among the charity is this wouldn't have happened if the employee was working in the office. Now, I assume that's because somebody would have overheard the employee having this 7-hour conversation and would have said, what are you doing? And the question really is, could the charity, or could charities generally, use this sort of heightened security issue as a reason to turn down people's requests for working from home? So as I say, there's a little bit of a kind of backstory to this, but obviously it's a situation that nobody would want to find themselves in, but it is a really good example of how these things can happen in real life. So I think firstly, obviously, we're going to have to assume that the question about working from home, not working from home is in normal times, and that we don't have to effectively allow people to work from home where possible under COVID regulations. It goes back to my comments about policies, training, etc. I think really you would have hoped that if you had given your staff appropriate training in recognizing scams, likely scams, that someone sitting on the phone for 7 hours and being asked to give out all of the charity's bank security credentials would have been alerted to the fact that this was a risk. Now, it might be that having given all of that training, it still happened, in which case, that could be an employment issue, could be a disciplinary issue, but you would only be in a position to discipline that employee, for instance, if you'd actually given the training and given the policies up front, because otherwise the employee could just say, well, I had no idea, it could have happened to anybody, and it'd be a lot more difficult, I think, for you to sort of pin the blame in that sense. In terms of working from home versus not working from home, it is a consideration. And if this is a very literal example. I assume it would be that you thought somebody would have overheard this and stopped her if she was in the office. But there could equally be situations where you just know that your charity's systems don't really allow you to put in place an acceptable level of security for people working remotely, and that you just don't have at the moment the resources to invest in the kinds of VPNs, etc., that you would need. In which case, I do think that could potentially be a legitimate reason for turning down a home working request. Particularly where the role in question is one here where it's a finance officer or somebody, that is dealing with passwords, security credentials that could really be open to attack. So, these things always sort of have to be on a case-by-case basis. And I think, I would encourage you to think about taking some advice if you were, really thinking about either taking action or refusing a request to work from home. And there's obviously statutory reasons why you can refuse a flexible working request. You'd have to follow any internal policies. But yeah, in theory, I think if you could genuinely show that for whatever reason, it's not possible for the charity to properly secure the types of data that this employee needs to use in a home working environment, and you couldn't reasonably make changes to your systems to secure that, I think it would be grounds. Okay, we don't have any other questions. If you do have a burning question, now is your time to type it, and we will answer it. Otherwise, was that another little one? Thank you. That's very nice.
You get those very often?
No. Otherwise, I think all that's left for us to say again is, thank you for attending. We hope that you did find this helpful and that it wasn't just a half an hour of feeling overwhelmed with scare stories. I do think that there are quite a lot of practical things that charities can do without spending lots and lots of money on expensive new technical solutions to try to protect your systems, and particularly in a COVID home working sort of situation. As I said at the start, we will be emailing you in the next few days with copies of the slides that we were using, and a recording of this webinar, and we'll also in that email include a feedback form. So if you can let us know your feedback on today's seminar, and also what you would like us to cover in the future, ideas for new topics, please do get in touch. Our details as well, mine and Tom's details, will also be in the email. So if there is anything that you want to discuss with us further, then you can get in touch with us directly.